That's great. Thank you very much, Peter. I'm sure there are several questions going to come in. Remember to put your questions in, you'd put them in the Q&A box. So start putting your questions in if you haven't done them already. So you were talking there about languages. First question is around, do you have to work in the Foreign Office, do you have to be good at languages, and do you have to be if you move around the world, presumably do you have to learn a new language every time you get a posting to a new country? How does that work?
You don't have to be good at languages. People are recruited on the basis of their personal abilities, the usual things, the competencies of leadership, communication, and so forth. If people have languages, then that is often an advantage. But you'll often find people who have graduated in Japanese are then sent off to learn Arabic. Most people do a language aptitude test at some point. If you do well in the language aptitude test, the one I did many, many years ago was they taught you a little bit of Kurdish on the understanding that nobody would be able to speak Kurdish. And they would test your ability to recognize different signs and grammar and vocabulary, and then they would decide whether you went to do Japanese, Chinese, Arabic, or so on. Normally, the Foreign Office is pretty good at teaching languages. So but it depends on what job you're going to be doing. If you're going to be, for example, ambassador in Estonia, you would probably need to learn Estonian. If you're going to be the consul in one of those places, you might not need the language so much. So it would depend on the type of job. But clearly, these days, as a head of mission, it's crucially important to have the language. And moving around, if you've done Spanish, then you've got lots of opportunities. If you've only done Estonian, then there's only one country you can go to.
Okay, good. A specific question about Cyprus. What are your thoughts about the likelihood of Cyprus being unified?
The last election in the north of Cyprus elected a hardliner. So the last attempt to solve the Cyprus problem fizzled out in 2017, and they got very, very close to reaching what we used to call a bizonal bicommunal federation. So you have north of Cyprus, south of Cyprus running a lot of its own affairs, but you have one identity and one member of the European Union. The new leader of the Turkish Cypriots, a man called Ersin Tatar, wants to have two states, and a two-state solution is a non-starter. The idea that the European Union is going to accept a separate Turkish Cypriot state, which will be taking orders from Ankara, is out of the question. So I'm a lot less optimistic than I was with the previous leader. The United Nations is now re-galvanizing its effort. The Foreign Secretary Dominic Raab was in Nicosia a couple of weeks ago. So I think there is a new effort underway, but I think it's going to be a lot more difficult with Ersin Tatar in place.
Okay. There's a couple of questions about moving countries. Do you choose the postings, or are they decided for you? And another more general question: what's it like to change countries so often during your career?
When I started, we were just phoned out of the blue and told where we were going. So I remember the first phone call, just right, this is personnel, you're off to Caracas. Fine, I was quite happy with that. So up until about the mid-1980s, it was a highly secretive process whereby people were posted to different places. Now, the postings, for future postings, are advertised well in advance. People pitch in and bid. You have to send your own, like getting into university, a personal statement, personal mission statement as to what you would do in that country. There'll be an interview process, and then a selection will be made. So you can't actually end up going to a place that you really don't want to go to, which is what happened in the past. I was involved in postings once in the 1980s, and there was a man who was a wonderful Spanish speaker, and he spent all his career in South America. And in the end, my team had decided that he would be posted to Georgetown in Guyana. It was still South America. And his face fell. He said, "Can I take my dog?" That was the only thing he was really interested in. Um, I always welcomed moving around. We moved about once every 3 or 4 years. I mean, the most difficult places you would do 1 year or 2 years, and the length of the time you would spend in a place would depend on how comfortable it is. So Rome, Paris would be 4 years, Kabul, Baghdad would be 1 year. Tripoli was supposed to be 1 year, but I ended up doing 2.5. It does get, it gets tiring continually packing up. It gets a bit distressing when you're constantly making friends, leaving them, and then having to start all over again. But the fresh view of starting in a new place, getting to know a new country, getting to know new people was always very invigorating. I think the family suffered a bit. The children ended up at the age of 12, 13 going off to boarding school. We were in Athens or Nicosia at the time, so it wasn't that far away. I think for them, breaking friendships and moving on, I think the hardest thing for our daughters was that we didn't take our pets with us because we didn't want them to have to go through quarantine on return to the UK. So there were pluses and minuses. But by the time it got to the end, in Tripoli, I just didn't want to have to do it again. It was time to return to the family home and stop moving around. They do say that moving house is the thing which causes more tension and stress than anything else. And we were doing it for a living for a while.
Yeah, okay. We've got somebody in the audience who actually was in Libya 2009, loved the people in Tripoli where she was based. Was rather upset to see the former residents' pictures, although she remembers spending a very good Remembrance Sunday there. She actually has a question, which is, do you think the Libyans will ever achieve a more peaceful environment? And do you think on the whole they regret the demise of Gaddafi? She knows from her Libyan students that they certainly felt safer when he was around.
I think, will they ever settle their differences? I think they've got a long way to go to create the sort of atmosphere of reconciliation, which is necessary. I mentioned, one of my main thoughts was about identity. And what I found was that Libyans lacked a sense of national identity, the sense of a national greater good, and therefore they're unwilling to compromise. Each group is in it for himself, his family, his tribe, his region. The idea of compromising, compromise for them is, if you're winning, I'm losing, I'm not going to let you win. And that feeling of national identity and national reconciliation is not yet there. They've just decided a new process. There's a meeting in Geneva 2 weeks ago, which has decided to have a transitional government leading to elections in December. I'm not confident that that will actually bring the country together. Do they regret it? I never heard many people saying, I wish we had Gaddafi back. Whereas during the time that I was living in Tunisia, just chatting to taxi drivers in Tunisia, they would often say, we were better off under Ben Ali. The streets were cleaner, we had jobs, we had tourism, things were better off under Ben Ali. I didn't hear the same being said about Gaddafi, but I think they regretted that the spirit of the revolution, which every politician is using, claiming in aid of his or her own agendas, the spirit of the revolution has been lost. It should be a country which, as I said, 6 million people, biggest oil reserves in Africa. It should be easy to have benefits for everybody. I think they do need to have a unified government which can reinvest in the people.
Okay. You mentioned that you go for the most difficult places have the shortest posting, and you talked earlier about understanding the local culture. But if you're in and out quite quickly, it's a question saying it's actually, if the most difficult places have the shortest posting, isn't that a problem? Because you need to get accepted and get something done, and you're in and out quite fast. How does that work?
I absolutely agree with that. I do agree with that. For a number of years, we had people going in and out of Yemen. In fact, most of the time, they weren't even able to go into Yemen. we would have people doing ambassador in Yemen for 1 year only. And I agree with you. I don't think you can really truly understand the country. Many of those people were not Arabic speakers. The man who's been doing ambassador in Yemen now has been doing it for 2 or 3 years. And I think there is a campaign within the Foreign Office since I left to try and encourage people to stay for longer. But if you are in one of those 1 year postings, you're probably separated from your family. You're by yourself. Maybe your spouse and family are back in the UK. You're with close protection everywhere you go, which is quite stressful. So I can understand that there are people who don't want to do that for too long. But getting that balance right between really getting under the skin of a country and spending long enough to, while also maintaining your own mental capacity, is quite a difficult thing to do.
You mentioned close protection there. Somebody'd actually like to know, did you yourself when you were in Libya?
No, I don't think I would have been allowed to. No, I had, they had machine guns and pistols with them, but they were all ex-military. We actually brought in a big container, and inside the container was a firing range where they could actually practice and zero their weapons, so they were correctly calibrated. But it reminds me that when I was director of security in 2003-04, I went to Baghdad because there was they were recruiting civil servants from all over the country to go and be part of the then Western administration in Iraq. And these young civil servants were going into Baghdad. They were being driven around by the American military, and they were being given a machine gun to carry with them, without actually having any training or knowledge as to how to use them. We had to stop that, and we had to introduce a huge team, a very expensive team of close protection officers and armored vehicles to protect them. But the Americans always tended to be a bit more gung-ho about how their diplomats behaved than we were. I'd also say that anybody who watched The Serpent and saw the Belgian diplomat in The Serpent carrying a weapon, I don't know which part of the embassy he was in, but we would not have been able to carry weapons in that way.
Okay. Moving on from weapons, somebody wants to know what's the most exotic thing you had to eat. You were talking about sheep's tongues, or we could broaden that slightly into what's the most exotic experience you had in terms of maybe ceremonies as opposed to just eating.
The presenting credentials is always a rather exotic ceremony. So you come with letters which are actually signed by Her Majesty, and they're written in wonderful exotic language, which say, my beloved Peter Joseph Millett, I behoved to him the duty of representing my country. And in Libya, we did this. There were 5 ambassadors who flew over from Tunis together, and they wanted to take us in a horse-drawn carriage to the palace. It was actually the fort in the middle of the city. We all refused. We were told there was no way we were going to go in an open-top horse-drawn carriage. My close protection team wouldn't allow that. But we were then escorted up, and there was a bagpipe band on the roof of this fort playing national anthems, and playing pretty well, actually. They played the bagpipes pretty well. And we were maneuvered round and lined up. We had to make a formal speech about our intentions. The president of Libya made a formal speech in return. We exchanged the letters, and it was all rather magnificent. The other thing I recall is going to Benghazi with the Foreign Secretary Boris Johnson to go and see the warlord Haftar. And we were ushered into the forecourt there, where there was a lineup of military. He had to walk up and down and inspect the military, some of which were women. The red carpets kept on blowing all over the place. And then the band struck up God Save the Queen. And if you Google God Save the Queen, Benghazi and Haftar, they played the most excruciating version of God Save the Queen on what sounds like a saxophone, a violin, and a recorder, all out of tune and out of sync. And the BBC, James Landale was with us. He recorded it, and in the aircraft on the way out, he said, "I've already tweeted it. I'm sorry," and it went viral.
Oh, fantastic. You mentioned there Boris Johnson visiting. There's a question about do politicians interfere? Without mentioning names.
It depends on whether they listen. You know, it's not like Yes Minister. It's not like the civil servants telling the minister what to do, but it's getting them to understand that local dynamic and understand why we are suggesting that they say the things that they want to say. Boris Johnson listened. He didn't always get the messages right, and certainly with General Haftar, it really was, they were talking at cross purposes, mainly Haftar's fault rather than the foreign secretary's. But I've come across a number of politicians who don't want to listen, who think they know it all already. In Cyprus, I had a junior foreign office minister who refused to be briefed. He said, I know it, I know what I need to say. He hadn't read the briefing. He refused to have a briefing meeting. And at the first press conference he did, he was asked a rather delicate question about this, a thing called the Treaty of Guarantee, which is the 1960s treaty in which the UK, Greece, and Turkey guarantees the territorial integrity of Cyprus. He was asked, will you give up the Treaty of Guarantee? And he clearly didn't know the answer, so he said yes. Whereas actually the answer was something which was a lot more nuanced. And the diplomatic answer was, well, if the Greek and Turkish Cypriots and the others agree, then we'll go along with it. But he got the answer wrong, and it was already going out on the wires. And we had to say to this minister, sorry, I had to tell him in the car, you got it wrong. I will arrange at the next press conference for you to be asked the same question so you can get it right. And he did. He went along with it because he had no choice. He knew he was going to get into trouble when he got back.
Yeah. Okay. In terms of British influence in these various countries, does it make a difference? And where do we now stand in the rankings? We're not as major a player as we used to be. We've got historical connections with places like Jordan, but the Chinese now, the Russians and others are perhaps more active diplomatically. Have we gone down the scale?
I think you're right to say that history is important, especially in the Middle East. Everywhere I would go, both in Jordan and in Libya, conversations would start by saying we have a historical relationship. You understand us. And if you look into Tobruk, we went to a cemetery where there are 2,000 British soldiers buried. So that historical relationship gives you access. It opens doors. We're still a permanent member of the Security Council. And in our role as permanent member of the Security Council, we hold the pen. So every resolution, every statement on Libya and on Cyprus is drafted by the UK delegation. And other issues will be drafted by the Russians, the Americans, and so forth. So we are seen as players. We are seen to have influence. So we're able to open doors. We can influence. People do listen. You have to be able to back it up with programs, with money, and marry our programs with our policy. I think this is where we haven't done so well recently. The merger of DFID with the FCO should bring the money we spend in development and programs closer to our policy objectives. I think we've also come down the rankings, partly because it was helpful being part of the European Union, because France, Germany, the UK together, not the other countries, those three working together. The fact that I was able to go to Tripoli with the French ambassador was an important signal. 3 or 4 big countries working together work and have a bit more impact and influence than one by itself. But also the European Union often had larger amounts of money to spend, and we were seen as being influential in the way the EU spent its money. I think we've lost a little bit, partly because the government has lost bandwidth because of Brexit. Ministers, for understandable reasons, for the last 2 or 3 years, have had their mind on other things. COVID has taken up a large amount of bandwidth as well. There's a review of British foreign security and development policy underway at the moment, which I hope will set out a clear strategy for what we want to achieve in terms of security, economic advantage. If we are to be a trading country, global Britain needs to mean more than a slogan, meaning more than arranging a good Olympics or having one or two companies that export things. We need to be able to spread our financial services, our manufacturing, all those consultancy activities as far and wide. I think the doors that the countries want to hear from us. They want to see also that we're working with partners. We can't do any of this. Climate change, biodiversity, refugees and so forth. Nobody's looking for us to do this by ourselves. I hope that the advent of a new administration in Washington will mean that that concept of partnership will be so much stronger now.
Okay. As well as politicians, this question about royalty, as well as politicians being helpful, it does having a royal family give us some advantage over other countries?
It does in Jordan, it did, because of the royal link there. And I think in countries that have a royal connection, like the Gulf is a good example, maybe one or two European countries, it helps a bit. In Libya, it made no difference whatsoever. In Cyprus, it was actually, I would say, detrimental, because in the 1950s, it's a little known fact, but the Queen actually had to sign the death warrant for the execution of various Greek Cypriot terrorists. So it played badly there, so we didn't use it. But I think in a country like Jordan, it was the icing on the cake, and it made a huge difference there.
Good. Okay, I think that's all the questions that we had. Oh, well, there's a very specific one here. Do you think we should have intervened militarily in Syria? It's a very specific one.
Oh, that's a difficult one. I think we missed the opportunity to do so when Assad was weak. Back in 2012-13, when Obama laid down the red line, if you use chemical weapons, that's a red line beyond which we cannot let you go. I think at that stage, if we had done it with the Americans and others, it would probably have led to the overthrow of Assad. But I think the legacy of Iraq was that there was simply no appetite. I think there is now no appetite for that sort of British military intervention in the future.
Okay, then one final question. Where is the one posting you wish you had had and why?
That's a tricky one. I think it would probably be Madrid, because a long time ago I did Spanish. Spent 2 very happy years in South America learning Spanish, and I never went back to a Spanish-speaking country. I did a bit of Spanish in Brussels with the Spaniards there, and I just thought somewhere in the Spanish-speaking world would have been a nice place to go. Madrid would have been ideal. Good.
Okay, well, on that note, I'd like to hand over to Jeremy Gaunt to say a few words of thanks. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. Both Peters, thank you. Peter Millett and I met in Greece when I was a journalist there, and he was a knowledgeable source. Oh, excuse me, he was an embassy worker. Peter is a little modest. He speaks magnificent Greek, magnificent Arabic. I imagine his French and his Spanish is as fluent as the other two. He's one of those people who seems to pick up a language when somebody walks past speaking it. That had an impact when we were in Greece, which a small story I'd like to tell you. When Brigadier Saunders was killed, the Greeks in the street, the public face of the Greeks was rather blasé about it. Their terrorist group had been around for a while. The brigadier was an army man. He was foreign. He was probably interfering in Greece. He was probably interfering in the Balkans. And he had a very Greek attitude towards it. And there was no sort of great outpouring that this was a terrible thing that happened. Peter arranged for a press conference with the brigadier's widow. And she read out a statement, or rather, well, she read out a statement in English. And rather than have a Greek translator, Peter did it on live television. He translated the Greek of what she was saying, which was all very emotional about losing her best friend and the family being bereft and everything. And in my office, which was, you know, there are a lot of Greeks in the office, they're journalists and they're fairly hardened types. There were people crying. It was so emotional. And the whole attitude in the newspapers and everything changed to, we must find these murderers, we must rid ourselves of this embarrassment, and so on. And so it was a very good example. And I know Peter was behind it all. It was a very good example of basically how diplomats can change things for the benefits of the countries that they come from. And I remember listening to that and thinking how amazing it was. And I've also enjoyed traveling around Jordan and Tunisia with Peter, and I've now enjoyed having the full speech about your career and things that I had not known. And on behalf of the Rotary of Henley and all the people who are listening in, Peter, I'd like to thank you very much.